So today we're going to be talking about England's reaction to absolutism and the Glorious Revolution. We're going to be working from Queen Elizabeth I to William of Orange or William III. And there is a lot of information that's going to be coming at you, a lot of names. My suggestion is that in addition to taking notes on a separate sheet of paper, work a little timeline. And as things come at you, add to your timeline so that you can get kind of a bird's eye view of what we're covering today once we're done with the notes. So here you have pictures of Queen Elizabeth I on the left and William of Orange on the right. So Queen Elizabeth I, who participated in our press conference, is the daughter of Henry VIII, and she goes to battle with Parliament over finances. Parliament holds the purse, if you will. They have the money, and so she has to go to them and ask them for money to pay for the programs that she wants to establish or the wars that she wants to fight. So the main point here is that the monarch, in this case the Queen, is having to work with Parliament in order to get things done. Now, Queen Elizabeth I is a Protestant, that is a Christian. She has no heirs because she is the Virgin Queen. So when she passes, her cousin James inherits the throne. So James I believed in the absolute power of the monarchy. And he also had a rocky relationship with an increasingly demanding Parliament. Now, it would be a mistake to think of Parliament as a democratic institution or even the voice of the common citizen. Instead, at this point, Parliament was a forum for the interests of the nobility and the merchant classes. So these are the wealthy and powerful people represented in Parliament, not the average citizen. James was also a firm Protestant, and in 1604, he actually expelled all Catholic priests from the island. This was one of the factors that led to the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. You may know of this if you've seen the movie V for Vendetta. In this movie, a group of Catholic plotters planned to blow up Parliament when it opened on November 5th. But an anonymous letter was found, and it betrayed the plot and the plotters. And one of the plotters, Guy Fawkes, was captured in the cellars of Parliament with enough gunpowder to blow the place sky high. Most of the plotters, additional plotters, were then captured and executed. So during James's reign, radical Protestant groups called Puritans began to gain a sizable following. Puritans wanted to purify the church by paring down church ritual, educating the clergy, and limiting the powers of bishops. King James resisted that last piece. He did not want to limit the power of the bishops. He said that the powers of the church and the king were too closely linked, and he said if there was no bishop, there'd be no king. So James's attitude toward Parliament was clear. In 1614, he thought that he was surprised, actually, that his ancestors had permitted such an institution to come into existence. And he said that he felt it was treasonous to allow Parliament to limit what the king might do at the height of a king's power. So when James I passes away, his son, Charles I, takes over, and this is in 1625. So Charles I continued his father's acrimonious relationship with Parliament, squabbling or fighting over the right to levy taxes. This is the same argument that Elizabeth I was having, and then James I and now Charles I. So all of these monarchs are kind of having to fight with Parliament over getting money. Parliament responds to Charles I's requests for money with the Petition of Right in 1628. And this was the most dramatic assertion of parliamentary power since the Magna Carta back in 1215. Its basic premise, this Petition of Right, as you see here, was that no taxes of any kind could be passed or allowed without the permission of Parliament. It also included these other bullet points that the king cannot imprison subjects without due cause. There would be no quartering of troops in Englishmen's homes and no martial law in times of peace. So by 1629, so this was in 1628, the Petition of Right, the following year, the relationship between Charles and Parliament had deteriorated such that Charles I actually dissolved Parliament. And for the next 11 years, he ruled without Parliament at all. In order to get money during this time, because Parliament had been the power of the purse, Charles had to find dubious ways of getting the money, not always legal. For instance, in 1634, he attempted to levy ship money, which is a tax that had previously applied only to ports, but he tried to do this to the whole country. As you might imagine, this really upset the English citizens. So in 1640, in a desperate attempt to get money, Charles summons a parliament back. He brings them back. But Parliament refuses to vote to give Charles more money until its grievances were answered. So the king, 3 weeks later, dismisses Parliament again. At this point, a rebellion broke out in the English territories of Scotland, in the English territory, rather, of Scotland, and Charles was forced to call a new parliament. And this new parliament sat until 1660. So this parliament, that Charles doesn't really want, but has to have, makes increasing demands, and the king continues to refuse to meet those demands. Neither the king nor Parliament was willing to budge. And so in 1642, fighting broke out. This period is called the English Civil War, and it lasts 4 years, from 1642 to 1646. And during that time, English society was really divided among class lines. There was the middle class that mostly supported Parliament, but the king was supported by the nobles, the clergy, and the peasants. So this war is going on. The parliamentary forces are led by a general named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a sophisticated general. He was very good at what he did. And he was able to whip his irregular volunteer troops into a very disciplined army. Meanwhile, Charles establishes a royalist headquarters, and he calls his own parliament, and he issues his own money. So this civil war that has broken out has Parliament on one side, with Cromwell leading the forces, and the king on the other side. And so because the king needs money to wage this war, he calls his own parliament and issues his own money. So there are two parliaments that are acting at this time. Charles, needing the support of more people, aligns himself with Irish Catholics. Now, we haven't talked yet about the Catholics, but there's a large, huge division between the Protestants and the Catholics in England. So when Charles allies himself with the Catholics, he's alienating some of his supporters, the nobles, the clergy, the peasants who supported the king, do not support his allegiance with the Irish Catholics. So Charles loses some support in joining with the Irish Catholics, but he also gains support in that he's allied himself with the Irish Catholics. So this war is going on, but really it's going on between the king and Parliament. The average English citizen continues to live life as they really always had. There were still programs to offer relief to the poor. There were unemployment measures. There were price controls. There was protections for small farmers. So for most people, life is going on as it always had. For the nobles, the Parliament, and the king, there's a war happening. Charles rather foolishly sticks to his absolutist beliefs. He refuses every proposal made by Parliament and the army for reform. Not his own Parliament. We're talking now the people he's fighting against in this civil war. So finally, the radical core of Parliament had had enough, and they believed that only the execution of the king was going to prevent the kingdom from descending into anarchy. So in 1649, Parliament hauls Charles I before them. This is the Parliament whose authority Charles I refused to acknowledge. But this Parliament finds the king guilty of treason, and they execute him on January 30th, 1649. So we've gone from Elizabeth I. When she passes, she's a virgin queen with no heirs. So her cousin James I took over. James led the country until his death, upon which his son Charles I took over. Both James and Charles have ruled as absolute monarchs, giving very little authority to Parliament. So when Charles I is executed, when Charles I is executed, and this is just more information here, he signed but ignored the Petition of Right. In order to get his funding, he establishes fees and fines like that boat tax. He becomes extremely unpopular. He needs more money, and so this is when the Civil War breaks out. So here is that Civil War we've been talking about. You've got the Royalists supporting James I. You've got the Puritans supporting Parliament. You've got Oliver Cromwell, who is leading the parliamentary forces. So Cromwell and let's see. Okay. Oliver Cromwell is the general of the Puritans, or parliamentary forces. They defeat the Royalists, then they arrest Charles, they try him for treason, and they execute him. So upon the execution of the king, Oliver Cromwell actually asserts his power. Now, this was the military general for parliamentary forces. And what Cromwell does is he creates what's called the Commonwealth. And this is from 1649, when the king is executed, until 1660. Now, ostensibly, Parliament is in control during this era, but the real power actually lays with Cromwell and the army. Eventually, the conflict between Cromwell and Parliament came to a head, and Cromwell establishes what's called the Protectorate. Now, this was essentially a monarchy by another name, and Cromwell is at the head. So England has replaced a tyrannical king, or what they believed was a tyrannical king, with a dictator, somebody, Oliver Cromwell, who was a military general, who is now leading the country as a monarch, but it is not called a monarchy at this time. Now, Cromwell, with Cromwell at the head of rule here, it is a time of rigid social and religious laws based on radical Protestant ideas. For instance, church attendance was mandatory. Horse racing was banned. Plays were prohibited. Gambling dens and brothels were closed, as were many ale houses or pubs. Drunkenness and blasphemy were very harshly dealt with. As you might imagine, people being people, these measures were extremely unpopular. Cromwell's leadership was not looked favorably upon by the masses. Cromwell always traveled with a bodyguard of about 160 men. So in the end, he's just as dictatorial and autocratic as the kings and queens that came before him had been. He called on Parliament only when he needed money. He dismissed Parliament when they argued with him. And really, nothing changed under Cromwell's leadership. On Cromwell's death, his son tried to assert the same power that Oliver Cromwell had asserted, but he just didn't have it in him. He wasn't the strong character that Oliver Cromwell had been. So as a result, the people of England confirm that they don't like military rule. In fact, they hate military rule. They are not happy with Cromwell's leadership. And so when he passes, Parliament decides to restore the monarchy. This is called the period of the Restoration. So in 1660, just 2 years after Cromwell dies, The English want the monarchy restored, and they approach Charles II. Charles II is the son of the king that Parliament executed many years before. Charles II was not as hard-headed as his father, and he agreed to some proposals that Parliament put forth to him, including concessions for religious toleration and a general amnesty for religious dissenters. So Charles II returns to London on a wave of popular support, and he's crowned in 1660. The Restoration was notable for a relaxation of the laws that had been passed under Cromwell, the strict Puritan morality of the previous decades. So theater and sports return, dancing is revived. And in fact, Charles's court, the people closest to him, his advisors, were known for their revelry. They liked to have fun. And that's what they did. So Charles was enjoying his new court, but he wasn't tending to the nation's international issues very well. The English fought a losing naval war with the Dutch. There was a plague and a fire and some other issues that really the king just didn't concern himself with. In 1678, there was an unsavory character that alleged that there was a Catholic plot. Remember the Catholics here, and we're going to talk more about them in a minute. But this character, Titus Oates, alleges that there is a Catholic plot, and that plot is in fact to murder Charles II, assassinate him, and establish Catholicism in the country of England. In the wake of this so-called popish plot, Catholics were excluded from Parliament. Some of them were arrested, some Catholics were killed. And this was only one of a series of either real or alleged Catholic plots against the king. Now, these Catholic plots are also called popish plots or popery, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Meanwhile, under Charles II's reign on the judicial front, there are laws passed, including the Habeas Corpus Act in 1679, which made justice officials responsible for the welfare of prisoners in their care, provided for a speedy trial, and ensured that a person could not be tried twice for the same crime. You might find that these laws are familiar because we too have them as part of our Constitution. Now, social conditions during Charles II's reign were abysmal. Laws were harsh, and religious nonconformists and Catholics faced heavy discrimination, not just Charles I, but his predecessors as well, including Cromwell. So laws are harsh, religious nonconformists and Catholics are facing heavy discrimination. On the other hand, things were so much better in England than they were the rest of Europe that philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu held England up as an example of a modern government, a model government, no less. So, Restoration, once Charles II is put back into power. But the thing is that Charles has no legitimate children. Charles II does have a brother, however, named James. The problem is that James is a Catholic. And since England was mostly anti-Catholic, and we have these popish plots, or the popery, that the Catholics have a plot out there, a conspiracy to overthrow or even assassinate the king and establish Catholicism, the English people are very concerned about the Catholics, and they are not happy that Charles has no legitimate children, and that in fact his next heir would be his brother James, a Catholic. So who's going to rule? Well, upon Charles's death, James II, the Catholic, does become king. And at first, James's authority seemed to be his authority appeared to be secure when he succeeded the throne in 1685 because he had promised to defend the existing government in church and state, and it reassured many of those who were concerned about his personal faith. But very soon it became clear that in fact James II wished to secure not only freedom of worship for Catholics, but also the removal of laws that precluded Catholics from occupying public office. In April of 1687, James goes so far as to issue a declaration of indulgence, suspending penal laws against Catholics and granting toleration. Then, the next year, in May of 1688, 7 leading bishops refused to follow James II's orders to read the king's second declaration of indulgence from their pulpits at church on Sunday morning. James responded by having these bishops arrested and taken to the Tower of London. They were tried and acquitted, and that was met with widespread public rejoicing. But the people of England are no longer comfortable with James II, a Catholic, leading their country. So 2 factors move James II's opponents to urge his son-in-law, James II's son-in-law, into action. First, after years of trying, James II's Catholic wife got pregnant. And now there is a birth of a healthy male heir, Catholic, for James II. This dashed the hopes of the English citizens that the crown would soon pass to James's Protestant daughter, Mary. Secondly, people that did not like James II believed that the parliament that James was planning to summon in the autumn was going to repeal the laws that disallowed Catholics from participating in government, which meant they believed that James was going to appoint more and more and more Catholics into these high government positions because that law that prohibited Catholics would be rescinded. So, what Parliament does, because they fear this succession of Catholic kings, is they approach James II's Protestant daughter, Mary. Mary had married William of Orange from the Netherlands. Both Mary and William are Protestants. So Parliament, fearful of Catholic kings, approaches the Protestant daughter Mary and her husband and asks them to come to England with an army to overthrow James II in the name of Protestantism. Now, William of Orange had ulterior motives. Yes, he would love to go to England and get rid of James II. But what he really wanted is he wanted to bring England into his war against Louis XIV's France, and a free parliament was seen as more likely to support this. So William and Mary of the Netherlands are engaged in a war against France. William wants to see England and all of England's money and military power brought into this war against France. So, if William can get rid of James II and get Parliament to support him at the same time to fight his war against France, it's a double win for William of Orange. So he agrees. William and his wife and their navy and their fleet land in England on November 5th of 1688. James II is hoping to be able to secure his power and defeat this invading army. Unfortunately for James, there were a number of people that defected and joined William and Mary, including the king's nephew, later his other daughter. At the same time, James's health also began to deteriorate. Poor James was frequently debilitated by heavy nosebleeds, of all things. So the final betrayal comes November 26th, just 3 weeks after William is leading his army, landing his army in England, when the king's other daughter, Princess Anne, absconded and joined William of Orange's cause. So when this happened, James II is seeing the writing on the wall. He's realizing that the people closest to him are deserting him to support William and Mary. So he announces that he is willing to agree to William's main demand, which was a free parliament. However, the king was also now convinced that his own life was in danger, and so he was making preparations to flee the country. He does flee the country in December, and in January of 1689, the Convention Parliament, made up of members from Charles II's last parliament, way back when, Charles II's parliament, convene in January 1689, and they offer William and Mary the throne to be king and queen of England. But before, here are some notes. Army is never needed because James II flees the country. So the bloodless overthrowing of King James II is called the Glorious Revolution. It is a bloodless overthrow in England only, in Scotland and in Ireland. In fact, there is much bloodshed, but it is bloodless in England. But when Parliament offers William and Mary to be King and Queen of England, they first have to agree to a Bill of Rights, which are going to limit the power of the monarchy and increase the power of Parliament. So this struggle between the monarch and Parliament continues. So William and Mary are presented with a document called the Declaration of Rights, later enshrined in law as the Bill of Rights, as you see here. In reality, the Bill of Rights placed few real restrictions on the crown, but it did affirm a number of constitutional principles, such as the illegality of suspending and dispensing powers. It prohibited taxation without parliamentary consent, and it affirmed the need for regular parliaments. So Parliament ultimately is going to gain powers over taxation. They gain powers over the royal succession, who should lead when the current king or queen dies. Parliament gained power over appointments and over the right of the crown to wage war independently. And these were all concessions that William thought were a price worth paying in return for Parliament's financial support for his war against France. So not only do William and Mary become the King and Queen of England, but they also gain Parliament's support in their war against France and increase their power. Okay, we've covered a lot of names, a lot of dates. We'll go over this again in class briefly, and I will be assigning some reading from the textbook about it as well. So for now, rewatch this video as many times as you need to. Get your notes down, and as suggested, put together a timeline that covers the events we've talked about so you can see this from a bird's eye view. It might help you understand the big picture here. All right, come to class with any questions you might have, and I will see you next class. Thank you.